In the summer of 1993, deep in the rolling hills of rural Wales, an ordinary farming couple was discovered dead in a manner that was anything but ordinary. The case would spend years tangled in courtrooms, controversy, and unanswered silence before delivering a shocking twist that gripped the entire nation. And to this day, the full truth of what happened on that quiet Welsh farm remains one of Britain's most haunting cold case mysteries. On the afternoon of July 26, 1993, a woman named Cheryl Tus picked up the phone and dialed her parents. She was 33 years old, and calling her mum and dad was just a routine part of her week. Her parents, 65-year-old Harry Tus and his wife Megan, aged 67, lived on a remote farm just north of Llanhari in South Wales, a peaceful and isolated pocket of the countryside where little ever seemed to happen. But that afternoon, nobody picked up. Cheryl tried again later that night. Still nothing. The silence on the other end of the line gnawed at her, and she eventually contacted the couple's nearest neighbors and asked them to pop over and make sure everything was all right. The neighbors agreed. What they found when they arrived was anything but all right, and the police were called almost immediately. Harry and Megan were, by every account, completely unremarkable people, and they would have taken that as a compliment. Harry had spent most of his working life as a fruit wholesaler before retiring to tend his land. He was well known and well liked in the local community, the kind of man who spent his days keeping a close eye on his cabbages and chasing off the rabbits that dared come near them. Megan and he lived quietly, simply, and happily, far from the kind of lives that invite violence or tragedy. Yet violence had found them anyway. When officers arrived at the property, they were confronted with a scene that was deeply disturbing precisely because of how deliberate it appeared. The bodies of both Harry and Megan were eventually located inside a cow shed on the farm, concealed beneath piles of hay. Each had been shot at close range in the back of the head with a shotgun. The nature of the wounds left investigators in no doubt that this was not a crime of rage or impulse. This was an execution. Calm, calculated, and premeditated. But the cow shed was only part of the story. Inside the farmhouse, something else caught the attention of the investigating officers. The kitchen table had been carefully laid out with the couple's finest china. Not their everyday crockery, but the good stuff, the pieces they saved for occasions that mattered. Among the items on the table was a particular teacup that family members later confirmed was only brought out when someone important was visiting. The cutlery matched in the same spirit. This wasn't a casual lunch. The couple had been preparing to receive someone. Their midday meal had been made, and it was believed they had switched off the stove to put the kettle on for a guest. A clean white shirt had been laid out in the bathroom, further suggesting that the day had some kind of significance to them. From this, detectives drew an early and important conclusion. Harry and Megan almost certainly knew the person who killed them. They had welcomed this individual into their home. They were making them feel comfortable. Whatever came next, they had not seen it coming. The timeline investigators pieced together was precise enough to paint a disturbing picture. Early on the morning of the 26th, the couple had left their farm to collect their pensions in the town of Llanhari. People who saw them in a nearby shop described them as perfectly normal. No anxiety, no tension, nothing to suggest that anything was weighing on them. They returned home at around 11 in the morning. Then, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, 2 gunshots rang out roughly 30 seconds apart. Nobody nearby paid it much mind. Harry was known for firing at the rabbits that kept raiding his vegetable patch, and the sound of a shotgun on a rural Welsh farm was hardly cause for alarm. 90 minutes after those shots were fired, Cheryl made her first unanswered phone call to the house. When forensic investigators got to work, the details they uncovered told a chilling story about the sequence of events. Harry had been shot first, just inside the doorway of the cow shed. Megan appeared to have been shot separately, possibly closer to the farmhouse itself, perhaps in or near the kitchen. There is a deeply unsettling theory that she realized what was happening and tried to run. She didn't make it far. Her body was then dragged back to the cow shed and covered with a carpet before hay was piled on top of her. Drag marks on the ground confirmed that at least one of the bodies had been moved after death. There was no evidence of forced entry anywhere on the property. Nothing had been stolen. Expensive jewelry remained untouched. Money was found both inside the house and still on Harry's person. There had been no struggle. A theory of murder followed by suicide was ruled out almost immediately, given the drag marks and the obvious effort made to conceal the bodies. What struck investigators most about the crime scene was the sheer meticulousness of it all. The cow shed was not visible from the road or from neighboring properties, which meant whoever chose it as a hiding place knew the farm's layout well. Heavy tools that were normally stacked against the shed's door had been moved to gain access, then carefully replaced afterwards. No spent cartridges were recovered from the scene, meaning the killer had taken the time to collect them before leaving. And despite the close-range nature of the shooting, which would have covered the perpetrator in blood and biological matter, not a single trace of such contamination was found anywhere on the property. One senior investigator would later say that the killing bore every hallmark of something thoroughly planned by someone who knew Harry and Meghan, knew their habits, knew their property, and knew precisely what they were doing. They came prepared, they executed their plan without deviation, and they left almost no trace of themselves behind. It was also revealed that Harry had a shotgun stolen from him in 1992, a full year before the murders. While there was nothing to confirm that the same weapon was used to kill him, the detail was noted. What police did know was that whoever had committed these murders had done so with a level of control and composure that was deeply disturbing to consider. As detectives began looking into the couple's financial affairs, a significant detail emerged. Harry and Meghan held a life insurance policy worth £150,000. Their sole named beneficiary was their daughter Cheryl. This turned the investigation sharply in her direction, and in the direction of the man in her life. Cheryl had moved out of her childhood home some time before the murders, which had not been easy for Harry and Meghan to accept. The couple were deeply religious people, and the idea of their daughter living with a man before marriage went against everything they believed in. To spare their feelings, Cheryl had kept quiet about the fact that she was cohabiting with her boyfriend, a man named Jonathan Jones. She and Jonathan had purchased a flat together in Orpington in Kent, but she continued to visit her parents regularly. The Tusses did eventually find out the truth about the living arrangement, though they apparently chose not to broadcast the information to their friends or community. Jonathan worked in recruitment consulting, though without much financial success. He had recently decided to try his hand at running his own marketing business, but this venture too was struggling. In fact, the couple's finances were in a far worse state than Cheryl apparently realized. They were teetering on the edge of losing their home altogether, and Jonathan had barely £100 left in his bank account at the time of the murders. It was this combination of desperate circumstances and the life insurance policy that led police to focus on him with increasing intensity. Jonathan Jones soon became the prime suspect. In the weeks leading up to the murders, multiple witnesses had spotted a man walking in the area surrounding the farm who appeared to be deliberately concealing himself. He was described as wearing a long trench coat and dark sunglasses on a day that did not call for either, and he was seen turning away from passing vehicles as though he didn't want to be recognized. At least one witness believed that the man matched Jonathan Jones. When police asked Jonathan about it, he said he had simply been in the area to help Harry with some work around the farm. As for the trench coat, several of his friends confirmed they had seen him wearing one. But Jonathan and Cheryl both denied that any such coat existed. Then came the fingerprints. Police established that the guest teacup on the kitchen table, the one reserved for important visitors, had Jonathan's fingerprints on it. Both he and Cheryl had insisted he had not used it. Furthermore, his were the only prints found inside the home that day beyond those of Harry and Meghan themselves. Jonathan also had no credible alibi for the afternoon of the murders. He claimed to have spent the day searching for office space in Orpington, with appointments to see several estate agents. None of those meetings could be verified. No estate agent recalled speaking with him. He additionally claimed to have had a conversation with a lift engineer at around 1:30 in the afternoon, which was precisely when the shots were fired at the farm. The lift engineer contradicted this entirely, stating he had been on his lunch break at that time and had no memory of any such exchange. Cheryl herself admitted that when she arrived home from work that evening, Jonathan was absent and she could not account for his whereabouts. He would later admit to investigators that he had lied about the estate agent appointments. He offered no satisfactory replacement explanation. In the early hours of the morning following the murders, at around 3 o'clock, Jonathan arrived at the farm. He claimed Cheryl had asked him to go and check on her parents because she was worried and could not leave work herself. But when he got there, his reaction to the news of their death struck officers as peculiar. He also took considerably longer to arrive at the scene than the journey should have required, something he attributed to bad weather. Police would quietly note that his delay created a window of time that remained unaccounted for, and there was quiet speculation that the detour may have been used to dispose of incriminating clothing and perhaps even the murder weapon. 2 months after the deaths of Harry and Megan, Jonathan was arrested. Investigators felt strongly that he had been withholding information, and they also had their eye on Cheryl, who had been similarly evasive when questioned. In 1995, the case went to trial. The prosecution constructed a theory in which Jonathan had arrived at the farm unannounced on the morning of the 26th, perhaps while the couple were in town collecting their pensions, or sometime after their return at around 11. The Tusses had invited him in for tea, perhaps imagining, with some hope, that he had come to ask for their daughter's hand in marriage. The prosecution alleged that he had traveled by train to Pontypridd that day and returned to Orpington that same evening at around 7:30. His motive was the life insurance money that would go to Cheryl and, by extension, relieve the suffocating financial pressure bearing down on them both. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Cheryl, however, was certain that the man she loved was innocent. She refused to accept the verdict and posted a reward of £25,000 for any information that could verify Jonathan's alibi or otherwise prove he did not commit the murders. The money, in a detail that did not go unnoticed, came from the very life insurance payout she had received following her parents' deaths. Cheryl's unshakable belief in Jonathan created painful rifts within her wider family, many of whom were equally convinced of his guilt. She stood almost entirely alone in her position. Jonathan pursued an appeal on multiple grounds. His legal team worked to establish an alibi, but no supporting witness was ever found. To this day, his whereabouts on the afternoon of July 26, 1993 remain completely unverified. Despite this, the Court of Appeal eventually decided to allow one of his appeals, ruling that a retrial would be inappropriate under the circumstances. He was released from prison, and Cheryl was waiting for him outside the courthouse. She told reporters it was a victory for love and for truth. In the years that followed, the case was revisited on several occasions. In 2003, it emerged that the police had received an anonymous letter the previous year containing information related to the murders. The contents of that letter have never been made public. Investigators believed that the writer was a genuine source of information but not the killer themselves, and they issued an appeal for that person to come forward with further details. In 2004, a shotgun and a quantity of cartridges were recovered from a disused mineshaft not far from the farm. Testing was conducted, but the items were not believed to be connected to the case. Over the years, one other person of interest was publicly named in connection with the murders. John William Cooper, sometimes referred to as the Bullseye Killer, was a Welsh criminal with a record that included roughly 30 robberies and violent assaults. In 2011, he was convicted of the murders of a brother and sister, Richard and Helen Thomas, killed in 1985, and of the double murder of Peter and Gwenda Dixon in what became known as the Pembrokeshire Coast Murders in 1989. Cooper had also sexually assaulted 2 teenage girls in 1996. Because Cooper had carried out several of his attacks with a shotgun, because he favored close-range violence, and because some of his crimes involved attempts to conceal victims, comparisons to the Tus murders were drawn. The time period overlapped, and the similarities on paper were enough to prompt a serious review of whether he could be responsible. But when investigators looked more closely, Cooper did not fit. He was not familiar with the Lanharry area, and he tended to operate only in places he knew well. Crucially, the fact that Harry and Meghan had laid out their finest china and their guest teacup for a visitor meant that the killer was almost certainly someone they recognized and welcomed. Cooper was a stranger to them. Beyond that, Cooper's trademark was to shoot his victims in the face, not from behind execution style. He was eventually dismissed as a suspect. For more than 3 decades, the case of Harry and Megan Tus sat in a frustrating limbo, revisited periodically but never resolved. Then, in late 2025, an announcement broke through the silence. An 86-year-old man had been arrested in connection with the murders. He was not named publicly. The arrest came off the back of a cold case review launched in 2023, and very few details about the suspect or his connection to the case were made available. The senior investigating officer, Detective Superintendent Mark Lewis, spoke to the press and said that while the arrest was a significant development, inquiries were ongoing and a great deal of work remained to be done. He noted that the case had affected many lives over the years and that the goal was still to find answers to the questions that had gone unanswered for more than 30 years. He appealed once again to anyone with information to come forward. As for Jonathan Jones, he and Cheryl eventually married after his release from prison. They went on to have 1 child together. The questions at the heart of this case have never gone away. Who came to that farmhouse on that summer's day and accepted a cup of tea from an elderly couple before leading them to their deaths? Who moved those tools, collected those cartridges, and walked away without leaving so much as a footprint? And does an 86-year-old man now hold the answers that have eluded investigators for over 3 decades? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. If you found this compelling, please like the video and subscribe to support the channel. Thank you for watching. Stay alert, stay safe, and I will see you next time.